You don't start at absolute zero. And you begin to collect the increment and theory and history and predict that you get the increment growing over time like this. So that by the time you get out to 2038, you are collecting a large sum of money from the strong neighborhoods area for redevelopment purposes. Now, something interesting happens in redevelopment land, and it's starting to happen now that I think is useful for you all to understand. That is, redevelopment areas are by law time limited. And they're about between 30 and 50 years, generally 50 years in their time limit. And that seems like a long time, but time passes quickly, as those of us who had birthdays understand. And there are two things that happen. Before an area expires or sunsets, 10 years before, in fact, there's a critical date that happens. You are no longer able to make new expenditures from that project financing area. You are able to pay off debt and able to close out what you're doing, but you essentially become what they call in the industry coupon clippers, clipping the coupons that we used to get for your mortgage and writing the check and mailing the back end. So San Jose has a number of different redevelopment areas which were adopted at different times. This is not going to sync up perfectly. But again, most of the tax increment in redevelopment is collected from North San Jose. There are 3 primary areas in North San Jose, different rincons, that are the source of this. They begin to expire on or around 2028. So in 2018, 10 years before they expire, they are no longer a source of revenue for new projects or new funding. They are a source of revenue for paying off existing debt. So what happens, I believe we're actually starting to see the shoots of recovery here in Silicon Valley, and I'm going to portray that as a reasonable recovery over time, is that the tax increment in North San Jose continues to do this. And let's see, the deadline here. You know, we will probably continue to bond against it as well. You need to have a gap because you need to have coverage to make sure your bondholders don't go crazy on it. And there are also some expenses that can't be paid out of bond funds, so you need pay-as-you-go expenses for some things. What happens here is again, terribly interested, if you're interested in financing. Once this funding, or at least much of this funding, becomes restricted for new projects, what does it do? It goes to pay off the debt. So what happens with this debt line, let me make it in yellow, orange so you can see it. I'll do the TI in orange here. What happens then is that this debt ratio, and this is without the new strong neighborhoods, this debt ratio starts to do, actually it's more like this, starts to do that, theoretically. Now there's a little bit more complexity to it, but that's basically the shape. Because by 2028, you make your last payment on your house, the mortgage is yours, and you're out of the repayment business. Now, what's interesting here is that you still have, at this point, $250, $300 million of tax income. What happens to that? Well, the losers become the winners. The city, the county, school districts are all getting their share back of this piece. And particularly the county and the city at this point stand to reap a very large hit back to their general funds. So, the proposal with strong neighborhoods would create a new area capable of gathering the tax increment and stretch that out over to 2038 and a little bit beyond. A couple of things here I want to talk about. So how do you think about this money? How is the city and the agency thinking about this money? And I want to create a little bit of a frame with some principles, 4 principles about how the city and the agencies are starting to think about this money. These aren't hard and fast or written in stone or engraved in the Bible anywhere, but they are beginning of principles. So, first one is founded in law. California state law, specifically the Health and Safety Code 33400. It must eradicate blight physical or economic blight. This work is things that you're all very familiar with. Everything that we have financed through Strong Neighborhoods has fit into this category, almost all of it. If it hasn't, it's probably been funded from some other place. So that can include enhanced code enforcement, that includes city attorney's office working on blighted properties, that can include housing rehabilitation, it can include community centers in underserved areas, it can include parks, it can include a whole lot of things. It is restricted to eradicating blight, and it is restricted geographically. When this money was in the general fund, the city could spend it anywhere for anything. Once it's in the redevelopment area, it must primarily spend it in the redevelopment area for a redevelopment purpose. You can no longer pay salaries of just normal cops or normal city staff who aren't doing work directly related to eradicating blight. I couldn't, as much as I love the librarians, I can't fund the librarians out of this source, as an example. Okay? So that's one principle that's rooted in law that's very important. I think there are probably 3 new principles, in addition to the California legal one, that I would suggest that we ought to consider. Two of them are based out of, one of them is based out of the necessity of redevelopment, one of them is based out of the necessity of the city, and the third is the necessity of the neighborhoods. So what does redevelopment need this to do in addition to eradicating blight? Well, if this is going to happen, it needs to have a similar dynamic to what happened in North San Jose. It needs to increase property values. One of my favorite examples of this is the work we've done in Greater Gardner neighborhood, where we replaced streets that you could have lost a Volkswagen in. We repaired sewers and sewer lines connected to the houses. We redid sidewalks. In fact, connected sidewalks which non-existed in many cases. Put in very nice street trees in collaboration with the owners, so we put them in the right place. And the result has been that the property value of that neighborhood shot up. What I like about it is many of the same owners were able to maintain their homes there. It did not necessarily gentrify. But what we saw, which surprised us, is not only did it look better because it had curb appeal, but people who'd been living in their home 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years suddenly began investing large sums of their own money into their home, the exterior of their home, and improvements of their home, which they otherwise wouldn't have done because they felt like it wasn't warranted because they lived on a crappy street. That's an investment that eradicates blight and increases property values. It also meets the next criteria, which is going to be very important to the city, is, and I'm going to introduce some jargon, but I'm going to explain it, is that it is neutral or decreases O&M. What's O&M? Operations and maintenance. Once you build something, you must operate it and maintain it, or it deteriorates. So when you build a park, you have operations and maintenance costs. When you build a community center, you have operations and maintenance costs. The beauty of what happened in Greater Gardner, from the city's perspective, fiscally, is that it actually reduced their operations and maintenance costs. They were coming out and having to repair the potholes in a haphazard fashion. That costs a lot more money than keeping a newly built street in good shape. So our sense is, because of the tight situation, fiscal situation the city is in, we are no longer going to be in the business of building projects that have large O&M costs. In fact, we're going to be looking only at projects that are either neutral on the O&M or decreases the O&M. So what does that mean about community centers? Well, unless you've got an operator who's not the city, they're not going to get those. What about parks? Unless you have a way of maintaining that, they wouldn't be built out of this fund. What would be built are projects like the infrastructure work, the housing rehab, infill development, neighborhood action, and others that are either neutral or have a positive effect on operations and maintenance. When you do those kinds of things, they actually decrease the city costs. Charles, you had a question or observation.
Where did who thought up these 4 criteria, and why were these picked?
Well, because each one of them has an interest to it. One is California law. One is this is needed if it's going to work overall in the long term. And then this is the interest of the city. So these are draft. These are ideas that we're working on. So the third one. Yes.
So are these programs funded right now?
No, these aren't programs. These are principles that we're looking at applying.
The O&M where you've got housing rehab and that type of stuff. Is that currently funded?
I'm not understanding your question.
Because I know the housing rehab, there were some people that had applied for it and it started going through the process, and before they got to the end of it, they're told that the funding needs to be cut off.
Oh, yeah, we have no money.
Yeah.
This is, if we are going to get new money, how would we spend the new
Oh,
money?
okay.
Right?
Hopes and dreams.
Yeah, this is the sort of like looking forward. If this happens, what is a way that makes sense to spend the money that is fiscally responsible for the city and for the redevelopment agency and works for the neighborhoods? And let me get the last one in before I take questions, and then I will. This is the important one. It has to be a neighborhood priority. Now, one of the interesting things about strong neighborhoods is that the funding for strong neighborhoods, again, came from outside, the $104 million, primarily from our San Jose. In this case, this would be funding generated from within the neighborhood. So one of the ideas on the table is that it needs to connect back with the priorities of the neighborhoods from which the funding is derived, from which the blight finding is made, justifying the tax increment. So these four principles put together are the ones that would drive potentially new funding. Now, what's important about this, in my idea, this is all theoretical at this point, is that I would argue that it's not that you meet one or two of these. Really, any project would have to meet all four of these to qualify. You'd have to eradicate blight, because that's the law. You'd have to be neutral on O&M, because that's a fiscal situation in the city. You'd have to increase property values, because that's the only way it works in the long haul. And it'd have to be a neighborhood priority. So let me stop there. There's a couple of questions. Steve.
So this would codify and hold us solid to this principle of neutral or decreased O&M.
Good question. Very complex answer. At this point, it depends on how this is implemented. You could do it in a way that codified it absolutely. You could do it in a way that says we're going to do this for the next 5 years. You could do it in a way that says we'd like to do this, but we're not really necessarily making any commitments. And that all has yet to be decided. Is that helpful?
It's helpful, and regretfully, it causes me to sort of like say, I don't want to see that, because at this stage of the game of this dogmatic principle of no addition to O&M, the city is being destroyed.
Well, you have to remember what's happening here from the city perspective on this particular funding stream, and it's important to understand this. The immediate gap that is caused is on the order of $4.5 million. That's $4.5 million of general fund that exists today that goes away. So the rationale for the city on this particular stream, and I'm not talking the larger picture here, on this particular stream is that they are already in the hole on the funding stream that they would use to pay for operations and maintenance. So in order to agree for this, they're not inclined to say, yeah, let's add things in this particular funding stream that will increase operations and maintenance. These are not general budgeting principles intended to be general budgeting principles for the city as a whole or for other revenue streams. The idea is it creates a balance or an equity within this revenue stream. And I know it doesn't fully address your point, but I think it's useful to clarify that. Harvey.
So, question, you said 2018 is when North San Jose, under current law, stops providing money into the kitty other than debt service.
And again,
What about downtown?
Downtown's already expiring. 2011, we were losing some redevelopment powers and related to a couple of high rises. 2014, one of the first redevelopment areas will be sunsetting. Downtown's tax increment is negligible.
Dearden?
Dearden is a strong neighborhood area.
So Dearden is not currently,
So in other words, we're not collecting tax.
We did an amendment for Dearden. It is within a strong neighborhood area.